You weren't just trying to survive. You were trying to earn permission to exist. Because in your family, love wasn't unconditional. It was a performance. And you were cast in a role, not because of who you were, but because of what they needed you to be. The fixer, the quiet one, the peacekeeper, the responsible child, the golden child, the scapegoat. They didn't love you. They loved the version of you that didn't disrupt the narrative. So you adapted. You made yourself smaller, more agreeable, more accommodating. You stayed silent when you wanted to scream. You smiled when you wanted to leave. You fawned when you should have been protected. Not because you were weak, but because your nervous system was trained to survive the role. And here's the part you don't want to admit. You're still playing it, just in different rooms, just with different people. Most people die still playing the role. They never even realize it's not who they are. Don't let that be you. Now you call it people-pleasing, imposter syndrome, social anxiety, guilt. But those aren't disorders. They're echoes, reflexes from a time when being yourself meant risking exile. Still wondering why setting a boundary spikes your heart rate? Why you brace for impact when you hear your name? Why a single no makes your chest tighten like you've just committed a crime? You were trained to break yourself before you broke the illusion. If you still feel guilty for saying no, if you overfunction just to feel safe, this video is for you. If your peace feels fragile, like it could collapse the moment you disappoint someone, this isn't personality. It's programming, and it's still running your life. This video will show you the hidden ways your family system scripted your identity, and how to finally delete the role from your nervous system. Because those traits you're desperate to fix, they're not your flaws, they're survival adaptations. And it's time to stop performing. It's time to break character. Stay to the end, because if you don't see the role, you'll never break it. You weren't raised to be a person. You were raised to be a solution. In narcissistic family systems, roles aren't chosen, they're assigned. Not based on your needs, but on theirs. The scapegoat absorbs the family's shadow. The golden child carries their pride. The mascot distracts from the dysfunction. The lost child disappears to keep the peace. The parentified child becomes the adult no one else would be. These roles don't reflect who you are. They reflect what your presence allowed them to avoid. According to Bowen's Family Systems Theory, when a system is unstable, it compensates by triangulating individuals, forcing one person to absorb the anxiety of the whole. That person becomes the emotional shock absorber. They call it the strong one. What they really mean is the one we can burden without consequence. And here's the brutal truth. Most people never step out of the role. They just keep playing it in different relationships, wondering why life still feels suffocating. And now, you're the one who fixes everything before it breaks, even when no one asked. You overfunction at work while silently drowning. You don't let anyone help you, because needing feels like failure. You still start your sentences with "sorry" when you've done nothing wrong. These aren't traits, they're trauma echoes. They are the reason you sit in meetings rehearsing your words and tone before speaking, why you avoid phone calls from certain people, even now. Your parents cast you in their unspoken play, and once cast, you were expected to perform it indefinitely, Don't rock the boat. Be the good girl. Hold it together. You're so mature for your age. You learned to measure your worth in how little you needed, how much you could fix, how easy you were to manage. Love became contingent, connection became currency, and the price of belonging was authenticity. That's why you feel guilty for resting, why boundaries feel like betrayal, why peace makes you anxious, because something must be wrong if no one needs you. It's why you still fawn for your boss and mistake exhaustion for purpose. These roles were never about nurturing. They were about control, control of the narrative, control of the emotional temperature, control of who gets to matter and who gets erased. You were trained to confuse identity with usefulness and worth with sacrifice. And now you're a grown adult still apologizing when someone else bumps into you, still asking for permission to rest, still typing your truth and then hitting backspace, still decoding every silence like it's a trap. Pause here. Let's take a moment to reflect. What version of you felt most accepted by them? What were you punished, silently or overtly, for expressing? Who did you have to become just to belong? These weren't identities. They were survival scripts. And now those scripts live in your nervous system, whispering guilt when you speak your truth, flooding you with doubt when you rest, shaming you for wanting more than you were trained to tolerate. It wasn't your role, it was your costume, and it's time to take it off. But first, let's look at how those scripts are still running your life right now. In the next section, we'll unpack how internalized roles shape guilt, boundaries, and self-doubt. They didn't just assign you a role, they rewired your instincts to protect it. When survival depends on emotional compliance, your body adapts before your mind can argue. This isn't personality, it's programming. Psychologist Pete Walker, in his work on complex PTSD, describes a trauma response beyond fight, flight, or freeze, the fawn response. Fawning isn't just people-pleasing, it's people-preserving. It's dissolving your needs, muting your truth, and becoming hyper-attuned to other people's moods. Because the cost of misreading the room wasn't awkwardness, it was punishment, withdrawal, humiliation, rage. You call it being accommodating at work. You call it not wanting to rock the boat in your relationship. You call it overthinking every message before you send it. But it's the same script, just playing on a different stage. Once your nervous system learns that peace only exists when everyone else is okay, you become the keeper of other people's regulation and the exile of your own. This is enmeshment's aftershock, where your sense of self is so fused with someone else's emotional state, you can't tell their discomfort from your danger. Your brain isn't defective, it's dysregulated. Polyvagal theory explains why. Your autonomic nervous system has been trained to skip fight or flight and go straight to freeze or fawn. Because fighting back was punished, running away wasn't an option. So you learned the one strategy that worked: comply, contort, keep the peace. Here's the trap. Most people never stop. They just transfer the role from their parents to their boss, their partner, their friends, and spend their whole adult lives mistaking exhaustion for love. And once fawning becomes habitual, it looks like this. You apologize before you've even done anything wrong. You over-explain your boundaries until they sound like requests. You edit your truth until it's palatable. Then wonder why no one really knows you. And worst of all, you feel guilty when you finally try to reclaim yourself. That guilt isn't your conscience. It's a reflex built from years of being punished for authenticity. You're not selfish for protecting your peace. You're not cruel for having limits. You're not wrong for wanting to be seen without performance. But your role taught you to anticipate emotional danger like a sixth sense. You learned to see your truth as the threat. So you delete the text that says what you really feel. You send a 3-paragraph email apologizing for not working late. You silence, you self-betray, all in the name of love. This wasn't love, it was nervous system servitude. And that's the crux of it. You weren't taught to love. You were trained to regulate them. And now you can't tell the difference between compassion and self-erasure. Let's stop here for a moment. Ask yourself this. What do you do to avoid conflict without even realizing it? What version of yourself gets activated when someone's upset? What parts of your truth do you shrink in family settings? This isn't just emotional reflex, it's role loyalty, a survival bond so deep it still shapes your sense of safety decades later. Even now, the child in you is trying to keep the system stable, even if it means losing yourself in the process. But not every child was cast to keep the peace. Some were chosen to carry the blame, the shame, the dysfunction no one wanted to name. In the next part, we'll uncover the scapegoat's burden, when you were framed as the problem to protect the system. Some families don't heal their shame. They hand it to someone else. They don't name the dysfunction. They disguise it by giving it a face. Yours. This is the scapegoat's burden, to carry the weight of the family's denial so everyone else can feel innocent. The narcissistic family system doesn't tolerate truth, it targets it. When a parent can't face their own inadequacy, they create a narrative where someone else is the issue, the problem child, the ungrateful one, the disappointment. Psychologists call this projection, a defense mechanism where the traits they can't stand in themselves are dumped onto someone else, usually the person who threatens the illusion the most. And often that's you. This isn't random, it's designed to protect a hierarchy. When one child starts asking hard questions, when one refuses to follow the script, they become the threat that must be neutralized. That's where triangulation begins. One sibling is elevated, the golden child. Another is discarded, the scapegoat, and the system stays intact. The scapegoat isn't punished for wrongdoing. They're punished for disruption. Your existence alone becomes a reminder of everything the family is trying to suppress. The mother's enmeshment, the father's absence, the siblings' complicity. At first, you resist the label. But when love is conditional, acceptance feels like survival. And over time, you start believing the story. This is gaslighting on a structural level, not just one person denying your reality, but an entire system rewriting it. Once you're cast in the scapegoat role, nothing you do can be right. Speak the truth. You're dramatic. Ask for clarity. You're difficult. Set a boundary. You're abusive. This is when shame hardens into identity. You stop seeing their behavior as the problem and start becoming the problem in your own eyes. Philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre called it the look, the moment you see yourself through someone else's gaze. But when that gaze is filled with contempt, You start to become what they hate, even if that hatred was never about you. You start performing damage control. You over-explain your existence. You contort yourself to avoid their scorn. And when that doesn't work, you collapse inward. You underperform at work, not because you're lazy, but because you've internalized failure as identity. You distrust compliments because they feel like setups. You don't just expect blame, you brace for it. That's not anxiety. That's conditioning. You disconnect from your voice. You question your memories. You exile parts of yourself just to stay safe. And here's the part that keeps people stuck. Most scapegoats never realize they were exiled because they could see too clearly. They spend decades trying to fix what was never broken. You weren't cast out because you were the problem. You were cast out because you saw the cracks they couldn't risk admitting were there. Truth needs space, so give yourself a breath here. What lie about yourself did they keep reinforcing? What part of their dysfunction did you carry as your identity? What made you the target of their shame? They didn't just label you. They trained you to believe it, to perform it, to identify with it. But what if the very thing they rejected in you was your clearest connection to truth? What if you weren't the problem, just the one who stopped pretending? Let's look at what happens when the truth teller becomes the family threat. But it's not what you think, and in the next section, I'll show you why. They didn't just reject you. They rejected the version of themselves they saw reflected in you. Because in narcissistic family systems, perception isn't neutral. It's dangerous. You weren't punished for being wrong. You were punished for being right. Too early, too clearly, and too often. When a child sees what the parent denies, that child becomes a liability to the illusion. In Jungian psychology, this is called the shadow, the unconscious, rejected aspects of the self. The parts they refuse to integrate get projected onto others, especially those who reflect them back with clarity. Carl Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But narcissists never take that step, because doing so would rupture the performance. So they don't just turn away from the mirror, they try to shatter it. And the mirror is you. When your perception of reality conflicted with their narrative, they didn't just disagree, they went to war on your identity. Not with facts, not with dialogue, but with dismantling tactics. When they said, "You've changed," what they meant was that you were no longer playing the role they had scripted for you since childhood. When they accused you of being selfish, what they were really saying was that you had stopped prioritizing their comfort over your own survival. And when they asked, "What happened to you?" it wasn't curiosity. It was an indictment for daring to have boundaries. These weren't observations. They were calculated scripts, sharpened to make you doubt your own lens. Because in a dysfunctional system, your clarity isn't harmless. It's a direct threat to their denial. And when denial starts to splinter, they will escalate. They will suddenly shower you with affection. The call out of nowhere after months of silence. The "I've been thinking about you" text. Not because they've changed, but because they need to pull you back under control. They will whisper into the ears of relatives or friends, rewriting your story so that you're painted as cold, ungrateful, or unstable. They will drop subtle guilt bombs. "After all I've done for you, family should stick together." Or worse, complete silence, letting you drown in the tension they've engineered. And without realizing it, you begin to fold inward. You second-guess your own memories. You wonder if maybe you are overreacting, too harsh, too sensitive. You replay every conversation like a crime scene, scanning for your fault. You start softening the edges of your truth until it's barely recognizable, packaging it in apologies, jokes, or even emojis, anything to make the backlash less severe. You learn to deliver honesty in a way that doesn't sound like honesty at all, because raw truth has always come with a cost, and that cost has always been you. Here's what most people miss. If they can make you doubt your perception, they don't have to change their behavior. This is why so many truth-tellers end up silenced for decades. This is adult life under identity gaslighting. It's not self-reflection. It's systemic re-traumatization. Your nervous system is trained not to identify truth, but to manage the fallout of speaking it. Healing isn't just emotional, it's neurological. Trauma therapist Pete Walker notes that cptsd often comes from prolonged relational invalidation. That's what this was. Not one moment. Thousands of micro-events. Eyes that rolled when you cried. Voices that twisted your honesty into betrayal. Smiles that vanished the moment you said something real. Now you associate clarity with conflict. You flinch when you speak honestly. You dissociate when someone gets defensive. You don't trust your perception because it was weaponized against you. But the truth? Your perception was never the problem. It was the evidence of what they couldn't face in themselves. Let's pause here for a reflection break. What did you see that no one else acknowledged? What truths were you punished for speaking? When did you start believing your perception was the problem? They didn't just disagree with you, they erased you. They needed to fracture the mirror because what it reflected exposed their shadow. It wasn't your clarity that hurt them. It was their denial that couldn't survive it. And now, something more dangerous is happening. Not defiance, but collapse. When the assigned role no longer fits and your nervous system can't keep performing, something cracks wide open. This is where most people go back, and it's exactly where you have to keep going. You never auditioned for the role, but you played it like your life depended on it, because at one point it did. The strong one, the peacekeeper, the responsible one, the invisible one. These weren't just family labels, they were survival contracts, conditional identities designed to keep the system stable, even if it meant erasing yourself in the process. And now you're waking up to it. But here's what no one prepares you for. The collapse of that role isn't a celebration. It's grief. The kind of grief that comes with no funeral, no sympathy, because no one else even realizes you've lost something. You grieve the version of you they applauded, not because it was real, but because it was useful. You grieve the belonging that was only ever offered to the performance, never to the person underneath. You grieve the loyalty you gave to people who were only loyal to the version of you that kept them comfortable. And now that you've stopped performing, there's silence. Not relief, not applause. Just the quiet after you walk off a stage you never chose. Psychologist Carl Jung called this individuation the painful but necessary journey of separating your true self from the roles, scripts, and identities imposed on you by your environment. It's not just about finding out who you are. It's about burying who you never were. Because what you're experiencing isn't just discomfort, it's ego death. It's what happens when the persona, Jung's term for the mask we wear for approval, begins to crack. And with that crack comes grief. Not just sadness, existential grief. You're not mourning a person. You're mourning a survival strategy. Like any strategy that once kept you safe, letting it go feels dangerous, even if it's slowly killing you. Here's what keeps most people stuck. They think the grief means they're going backwards. They don't realize it's the sign they're finally moving forward. That's why so many never break the role. They mistake withdrawal symptoms for proof they should go back. This is why healing feels like betrayal. You check in with people who ghost you. You say yes because you can't tolerate the imagined punishment of no. You call it being nice. But it's not kindness. It's preemptive guilt management. Because the moment you stop upholding the narrative, you stop being the good one. You become selfish, disloyal, cold. At least, that's what the system will say. The truth, you're not betraying them. You're rescuing yourself. Brené Brown describes shame as the fear of disconnection, the belief that if people saw the real you, they'd withhold love. That belief kept you inside the role. It made you feel safest when you were performing. And it's why freedom can feel like failure. But listen closely. Guilt is not a sign you're doing something wrong. It's a sign you're doing something new. When you set boundaries, guilt rushes in. Not because you're bad, but because your nervous system was trained to equate self-protection with selfishness. This is where reparenting begins. You start offering yourself the things your family withheld: validation, protection, presence. You stop waiting to be chosen, and you choose yourself. You stop contorting your truth, and you begin to speak it. It won't happen all at once. It happens in micro moments. The first time you say no without apologizing. The first time you feel peace without needing approval. The first time you recognize love without losing yourself inside it. These are milestones, not loud ones, not celebrated ones, but sacred ones. Because each one marks a shift from performance to personhood. Let's hold still for a moment and listen inward. What version of you is beginning to feel real again, now that the performance is fading? What are you grieving right now that no one else seems to understand? What's the first truth you want to say out loud, without apology? Drop your answers in the comments, not just for me, but as a reminder to yourself. Put it in writing so you can come back to it later. And know this, you're not speaking into a void. You're speaking into a community of people who see what you've lived through, because they've lived it too. This space is for the ones breaking old contracts, the ones walking out of their assigned roles, the ones building a life that no longer bends to someone else's script. Say it. Own it. Let the rest of us stand with you in it. You were cast in a role that never matched your essence. But now that the role is dissolving, so is their control. You don't owe anyone the version of you that made them feel powerful. You don't owe the system your silence. You don't owe your history your future. You weren't given that role because you were weak. You were given it because you were perceptive, because you saw, because you felt, because your clarity threatened their illusion. And that clarity, it's not just the end of their story, it's the beginning of yours. You don't arrive at freedom by healing. You arrive when the need to be understood dies, and you stop translating your truth into a language they will never speak. The gift isn't peace, it's precision, not self-love, but self-authority. That moment you realize you don't need them to be wrong anymore, because you finally stopped trying to prove you were right. Narcissistic family systems don't just program your behavior, they train your interpretation of reality. You were taught to distrust your intuition, to second-guess your perception, to confuse guilt with truth, to believe that internal discomfort meant you were doing something wrong, when all it meant was you were finally doing something honest. This is the return to self. Not a romantic reparenting fantasy, but a brutal confrontation with reality. You were conditioned to shrink, but you chose to see clearly, and clarity is the beginning of power. Viktor Frankl wrote in Man's Search for Meaning, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances." That's what they could never take. Your inner stance, your posture toward truth, your capacity to choose self-respect over inherited loyalty, your ability to endure being misunderstood and still not flinch. This isn't rebellion, it's sovereignty. Because when you stop chasing understanding from the people who trained you to collapse, you start building a life that doesn't require collapse to feel familiar. This is the real gift. Not that you found yourself, but that you can now recognize emotional warfare before it enters the room. What used to pass as love now registers as manipulation. What used to feel like guilt now reads as programming. What used to break you now activates your clarity. That's discernment. That's the scar that sees. And yes, it came at a cost. You lost time. You lost innocence. You lost relationships built on compliance, not connection. But in return, you gained something they never wanted you to have, an identity that doesn't depend on their illusion to exist. This is the end of their story, and the beginning of yours. You don't just stop making room for them in your schedule. You stop making room for them in your mind. You change your tone, your tempo, your entire way of being. And then you realize why your life never felt like it was yours. That's not maturity. That's muscle memory, finally breaking. Let's take a moment to reflect. One last time. What version of you are you ready to protect, even if it means being misunderstood forever? What truth about yourself did they try to erase, that you now refuse to hide? What part of your clarity feels like rebellion, but is actually freedom? If this made you realize you're still carrying a role that was never yours, drop it in the comments below. I was never who they said I was. Stand tall, say it loud. You were trained to shrink. Now it's time to return. Your story isn't just survival. It's blueprint. And it ends exactly where it should. Not with their validation, but with your sovereignty. Your freedom isn't theirs to give, and it never was.